I was already the villain long before anyone bothered to ask me why. The whispers started when I was still strong enough to pretend I didn't hear them. At church, the women leaned toward each other when I passed, lowering their voices like I carried a disease. At family dinners, the fork scraped louder than usual, and conversation stopped mid-sentence when I entered the room. Even my own grandchildren looked at me like I was something sharp they might cut themselves on if they got too close. They said I was cold, that I was cruel, that I loved money more than blood, and I let them believe it. Because at my age, you learn something most people never do. Sometimes silence hurts less than the truth until it doesn't. That morning, the one that still lives inside my bones, I woke before dawn with my heart pounding like it had been running all night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone else is still asleep or already gone. I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing old cracks with my eyes, remembering when that ceiling had echoed with laughter, slammed doors, and the sound of my husband's boots, coming home after midnight shifts. Arthur's been gone 12 years now. People like to say time heals. What it really does is sand things down until the pain fits into smaller places. It doesn't disappear. It just learns how to hide. I sat up slowly, joints protesting like they always did, and reached for the little wooden box on my nightstand. Inside it were things no one ever asked about. A key, a folded letter yellowed with age, and the copy of my will. Updated, signed, sealed, and misunderstood by everyone who would one day read it. They thought it was about punishment. It never was. By the time the sun rose, my daughter Marianne had already called twice. She always did that, checking on me without really checking on me. Her voice was tight, polite, filled with the kind of patience people use when they think you're difficult on purpose. "Mom," she said, stretching the word thin, "I just want to remind you that the lawyer's appointment is tomorrow. You don't have to be dramatic about it." Dramatic. I smiled to myself and said nothing. If she only knew how dramatic I had already been. How many nights I'd stayed awake, choosing words, erasing names, adding conditions that looked like cruelty, but were really confessions written in legal ink. After the call, I shuffled into the kitchen and made tea the way Arthur liked it, even though he wasn't there to complain anymore. The kettle screamed, and for a moment I remembered the night my son Daniel shouted louder than that kettle ever could. "You're ruining this family," he had said, standing right there by the fridge. "You always have." And that was 20 years ago. And still, every time I heard boiling water, my chest tightened. Daniel hasn't spoken to me properly since. Oh, he sends birthday cards, unsigned except for his name, no message inside. He shows up on holidays when guilt outweighs resentment. But there's a wall between us, thick and old, built from misunderstandings, and one terrible choice I made that no one ever let me explain. They think I favored Marianne. They think I cut Daniel out because he disappointed me, because he married the wrong woman, because he didn't become the man his father dreamed he would be. That's the story they tell each other. The real one is heavier. By late afternoon, my sister Ruth came by unannounced. She still had that look, the one that mixed concern with judgment, as if she'd already decided what was wrong with you before you opened your mouth. "You know they're all angry with you," she said, sitting at my table like she owned it. "This will business. You're turning your own family against you." I stirred my tea until the spoon clinked against the cup, slow and deliberate. "They turned a long time ago," I said. She frowned. "You could fix it. Change the will. Split things evenly. Apologize." Apologize, the word burned. If apologies could undo the past, I would have drowned the world in them. But some truths don't survive daylight. Some love only makes sense after you're gone. "I'm tired, Ruth," I told her. Tired of explaining myself to people who don't want to understand. She left, shaking her head, already rehearsing the version of me she'd tell others about. Stubborn, bitter, controlling villain. That night, I opened the old photo album I kept hidden under my bed. The one no one ever flipped through because it didn't show birthdays or weddings or smiling faces lined up neatly. It showed bruises I tried to hide. Hospital rooms. A tiny pair of shoes that never got worn long enough to be scuffed. And there, tucked into the back sleeve, was the letter I never mailed, the one that explained everything. My hands trembled as I held it, and for a moment, I wondered if I should destroy it. Let them keep their anger. Let them believe I was heartless. But then I imagined the reading of the will, their faces, the silence, the way confusion would replace rage one line at a time. They would finally hear my voice. Not the sharp one they remembered, but the trembling one I swallowed for decades. I folded the letter back into its place and lay down, staring into the dark. Tomorrow, I would walk into that lawyer's office as the family villain. Soon enough, they would learn why I chose that role and what it cost me to wear it. I learned long ago that the past doesn't stay buried just because you stop talking about it. That night, after Ruth left, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the clock tick like it was counting down something final. Every sound in the house felt louder. The pipes knocking, the wind brushing against the siding, the old oak tree tapping its branches against the window like it was asking to be let in. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the ache in my chest. But memories have a way of slipping through even the tightest defenses. I was 23 when I first realized love could turn dangerous. Arthur and I had been married less than a year. Everyone said I was lucky. He was handsome, hardworking, respected. He opened doors, paid for dinners, held my hand in public like I was something precious. No one saw how his jaw tightened when he didn't like my answers. No one heard how quiet I became once the front door closed behind us. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward. I remember that part clearly, him kneeling on the kitchen floor, head in his hands, saying he didn't know what came over him. Saying stress made him angry, saying he loved me too much. I believed him, because belief was easier than admitting I'd made a terrible mistake so early in my life. By the time Daniel was born, the bruises were hidden better. Long sleeves, careful smiles, lies practiced so often they sounded like truth. Arthur never touched the children. Not once. And that's what confused people when they eventually learned pieces of our story. They couldn't understand how a man so gentle with his kids could be cruel to his wife. But cruelty doesn't need witnesses to exist. It thrives in private. When Marianne arrived 3 years later, I thought maybe this time things would change. Another baby, another chance. Arthur promised me it would be different. And for a while it was. He laughed more, drank less, held me when I cried. Then one winter night, everything cracked open. Daniel was 6, Marianne barely 3. Arthur came home late, angry about something I never fully understood. A bill, a comment from his boss. Maybe just the world daring to disappoint him. I remember standing in the living room holding Marianne when he shoved me hard enough that I hit the corner of the coffee table. The pain was sharp and blinding. Marianne screamed. Daniel ran toward me. And that was the moment I decided I would never let my children learn that this was what love looked like. The next morning, while Arthur slept, I packed a bag. Just one. Clothes for the kids, documents, whatever cash I could find. I took them to my sister's house, shaking so badly I could barely drive. Ruth begged me to call the police, to tell everyone, to expose him. I didn't. Because fear makes cowards of strong women. Because I worried about what he'd do if I humiliated him. Because in those days, people didn't believe women like me unless our bones were broken in obvious places. I went back. That choice, the one I thought was protecting my children, became the first stone laid in the road that led to me being hated later. Arthur changed after that, not for the better, for the quieter. The kind of anger that simmers instead of explodes. He watched me, controlled the money, made it clear I wasn't going anywhere. Years passed, the kids grew, and I learned how to survive inside a life that wasn't mine. Then Daniel turned 16. That was when the secret that ruined everything began. I noticed changes in him first, withdrawn, jumpy, snapping at Marianne over nothing. One night, I found him sitting in the garage long after midnight, staring at the floor like it held answers. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer. A week later, I walked into the house earlier than usual and heard Arthur's voice upstairs, low, sharp, too close. Something in my chest tightened, a warning older than words. I climbed the stairs quietly, and I saw something no mother ever recovers from. Arthur standing too close to Daniel, a hand on his shoulder that didn't belong there. Daniel frozen, eyes empty, like he'd learned the fastest way to survive was to disappear inside himself. I don't remember screaming, but the neighbors later said they heard me. Arthur tried to explain, tried to say I misunderstood, tried to turn it around on Daniel, calling him confused, troubled, dramatic. I slapped him so hard my hand went numb. That night, after Arthur stormed out, Daniel broke down in my arms. He told me everything. How long it had been happening, how Arthur said no one would believe him, how he threatened to destroy our family if Daniel spoke up. And in that moment, I made the hardest decision of my life. I didn't call the police. Not because I didn't believe my son, but because Arthur controlled everything: money, reputation, connections. I was terrified that a failed case would leave Daniel exposed, humiliated, and trapped with a man who now knew he'd been discovered. Instead, I planned. I quietly moved money into an account Arthur didn't know about. I documented dates, behaviors, small details that felt meaningless at the time but would one day matter. I arranged for Daniel to leave for college early, far away under the excuse of opportunity. When Arthur found out, he accused me of poisoning Daniel against him, of turning his son into an enemy. That was the last conversation we ever had. Arthur died 2 years later in a workplace accident. Sudden, brutal, final. People told me I should grieve more. They didn't see me grieve at all. But grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like relief so deep it scares you. Daniel never came home the same. He blamed me for not protecting him sooner, for not exposing Arthur, for choosing silence over justice. And he wasn't wrong. That was when I became the villain in his story. And I carried that role quietly, believing one day, just maybe, he would understand. But understanding doesn't always come while you're alive. I thought once Arthur was gone, the house would finally feel like mine again. I was wrong. The silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, soaked with everything we never said out loud. Every room still felt like it was waiting for permission to breathe. I slept with lights on for months, jumping at sounds that no longer belonged to anyone. And worst of all, Daniel stopped calling. At first, I told myself he needed time. Trauma rearranges people. It makes them suspicious of love, wary of forgiveness. I wrote letters, long ones, careful ones, trying to explain why I did what I did, why I chose the quiet path instead of the loud, righteous one everyone thinks they'd take in a crisis. He never replied. Marianne, on the other hand, stayed. Or maybe she hovered is a better word. She helped with groceries, with paperwork after Arthur's death, with the practical things. But even then, there was a distance, a tightness around her eyes when Daniel's name came up. She had her own version of the story, one where I was too passive, too secretive, too willing to endure. She once asked me, "Why didn't you just leave him, Mom?" As if leaving was a door you simply opened. I didn't answer her then. I don't think she was ready to hear it. Years passed. Daniel married. I heard about it through Ruth, a small ceremony, no mother in attendance. That omission burned more than any insult ever could. I sent a gift anyway, something practical, impersonal, safe. I didn't want my presence even in wrapping paper to feel like a burden. When his first child was born, I cried alone in the kitchen. A grandmother by blood, a stranger by circumstance. That was when I began thinking seriously about my will. Not because I was dying, though at my age, death is always closer than people admit, but because I needed to say things I could no longer say aloud. Conversations had failed me. Letters went unread. Words spoken too early were dismissed as excuses. Maybe words spoken too late would finally be heard. I started by listing everything I owned: the house, the savings, Arthur's old watch, the small plot of land his father left us. Ordinary things that somehow carried extraordinary weight. Marianne assumed I would divide it all evenly. That's what good mothers do. That's what makes sense on paper. But fairness and justice are not always the same thing. Daniel had suffered something that changed the shape of his life, something I couldn't undo. Money wouldn't fix it. Apologies wouldn't reach far enough. But acknowledgement, real, undeniable acknowledgement, might. So I made decisions that looked cruel from the outside. I left the house to Marianne, I left the savings to charity, and I left Daniel Conditions, not nothing, never nothing, but not what anyone expected. The first time Marianne read the draft, because she insisted on being involved, she looked at me like I'd slapped her. "This is punishment," she said. "You're punishing him." "No," I replied quietly. "I'm protecting him." She scoffed. "From what? Money?" "From the lie," I wanted to say. From the idea that his pain could be measured in inheritance percentages? Instead, I said nothing. The conditions were simple on the surface. Daniel would receive his portion only after reading a letter kept with the lawyer. A letter no one else was allowed to see until after my death, and only if he agreed to one final request: to come back to this house, to open a locked door in the basement that no one had touched in over 20 years. Marianne thought I'd lost my mind. That door had been sealed since Arthur died, rusted shut, covered with shelves and boxes. I told everyone it led to nothing but mold and old junk. Another lie layered gently over the truth. The truth was harder. Behind that door was everything I couldn't say while I was alive. I remembered the day I locked it. Daniel had already left for college. Arthur was gone. I went down there alone, carrying boxes with shaking arms, journals, copies of bank statements, photos, a tape recorder I barely knew how to use. Evidence I collected quietly, obsessively, because part of me always believed I'd need it someday. I locked it because I was afraid of reopening wounds, afraid of what Marianne would think, afraid that Daniel would hate me more for not doing enough sooner. But time changes fear. It makes it tired. The lawyer tried to talk me out of it. Said wills weren't the place for emotional closure. Said families fall apart over less. "I know," I told him. "Mine already has." By the time my health started failing, the family villain story was well established. Ruth told people I was manipulative. Marianne complained I was controlling. Daniel, God help him, told anyone who listened that I'd always chosen silence over him, and I let them. Because the truth was waiting patiently in the dark. The night before my final hospital stay, Marianne sat by my bed, folding and unfolding her hands like she wanted to say something kinder than what she felt. "You could still change it," she whispered. "You don't have to go out like this." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had survived in a different way than her brother. Less scars on the outside, more resentment on the inside. "I already chose how I'm remembered," I said. "What matters is what happens after." She didn't understand then, but she would. Because when the will was read, it wouldn't just divide property. It would split the past open. They read my will on a Tuesday. I know that because Marianne once told me Tuesdays always felt unlucky to her. Funny how the smallest details linger when the big ones finally arrive. I wasn't there, of course. I was already ash by then, already scattered the way I'd requested. Quietly, without speeches or hymns, or anyone pretending they knew me better in death than they ever tried to in life. Still, I can picture the room as clearly as if I were sitting at the end of the table, hands folded, spine straight, waiting. The lawyer's office smelled like paper and lemon polish. There were chairs pulled too close together, a box of tissues no one wanted to touch, and a tension so thick it could have been wrapped and labeled. Marianne sat rigid, already braced for disappointment. Ruth perched beside her, lips pursed, eyes sharp. Daniel arrived last. He almost didn't come. I know that too. Something pulled him there at the last minute. Maybe obligation, maybe curiosity, maybe the same unfinished ache that had lived in his chest since he was 16. He looked older than his years, carrying himself like someone who learned early that the world wasn't safe, even inside his own home. They didn't speak to each other. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. Formal language, legal phrases. My name said out loud in a tone stripped of warmth. Marianne nodded along as if she were checking items off a list. Ruth leaned forward when the house was mentioned. Daniel stared at his hands, then the words changed. The house was left to Marianne. Ruth exhaled, satisfied. Marianne blinked, surprised but relieved. That part made sense. That part fit the story they already believed, that I favored my daughter, that I rewarded loyalty and punished distance. Then came the savings. Donated. Gone. Marianne stiffened. Ruth frowned. Someone muttered something under their breath. And then Daniel's name filled the room. The lawyer paused before reading that section. He always did that. The careful ones, the ones who knew what came next would bruise. Daniel inherited a sum. Modest, conditional, tangled in language that sounded cold if you didn't know how hard it had been to write. He was required to read a letter kept in the firm's possession, alone. And before receiving anything, he was required to return to my house and open a locked door in the basement, using a key that would be provided to him and only him. Marianne stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "This is ridiculous," she said. "She's still controlling us." Ruth agreed, loudly, said I was spiteful, said I wanted the last word. Daniel didn't say anything. He just asked for the letter. The lawyer shook his head. "Not yet." That was when anger finally reached him, not explosive, not dramatic, just quiet and sharp. "She's still doing it," Daniel said, "still making me jump through hoops." He almost walked out. I know that moment too because that's the one I worried about most. The one I planned around, rewrote for, whispered apologies into the dark about. If he'd left, everything would have stayed buried. The truth would have died with me. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the key placed gently on the table. Old. Familiar. The one that used to hang on a nail in the basement before I hid it away. Daniel took it. The house greeted him like it always had. Quiet, heavy, unchanged. Marianne refused to go inside. She said she was done playing games. Ruth stayed on the porch, arms crossed, already rehearsing her condemnation. Daniel walked through alone. The basement smelled like dust and cold stone. The shelves were still there, stacked with boxes I'd labeled in careful handwriting. The door waited behind them, scarred and rusted, just as I'd left it. His hands shook when he cleared the shelves, when he slid the key into the lock. When the door finally gave way with a sound like a breath being released, inside the light flicked on to reveal the past. Boxes upon boxes, journals stacked in order, files neatly bound, a tape recorder sitting on a small table, a note taped to it in my handwriting. For you, only you. Daniel sank onto the floor. He started with the journals. The earliest ones first. My handwriting younger, neater. Pages filled with fear I never spoke. With apologies I never delivered. With dates and times and descriptions I forced myself to write so I wouldn't later convince myself it hadn't been that bad. Then the later journals, the ones that mentioned him, the confusion, the dread, the night I walked upstairs and saw too much, the plans I made to protect him when I didn't trust the world to do it for us. He found the bank records next, the quiet transfers, the college funds. The reason he never struggled the way he thought he would. Money redirected without explanation, without credit. And then he found the tapes. My voice sounded older on them, weaker but clear. I told the truth on those tapes, all of it, why I didn't call the police, why I feared the consequences. Why I chose a path that looked like cowardice but was, in my broken way, strategy. I told him how sorry I was, over and over, for not being braver sooner, for making him feel alone, for letting him believe I chose silence over him. I told him the will wasn't punishment, it was acknowledgement. The money wasn't the gift. The truth was, Daniel didn't leave the basement until night fell. When he finally came upstairs, Marianne was gone. Ruth had already told half the family I'd gone mad. The house was quiet, just the way it had been the night Arthur died. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and cried. Not the restrained crying of a grown man who's learned to hide it, but the kind that breaks something open and leaves it bleeding. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't alone with it. The letter was heavier than Daniel expected, not in weight, but in meaning. The paper had softened with age. The edges worn the way things do when they've been held and set down too many times without ever being used. My handwriting filled the page slowly, deliberately, as if I were afraid the truth might run if I wrote too fast. He didn't read it right away. He sat at the lawyer's desk long after everyone else had left, the room empty now, the air still holding echoes of judgment and disbelief. The lawyer offered him water. Daniel shook his head, offered sympathy. Daniel didn't respond. Only when the door closed behind the lawyer did Daniel unfold the letter. "My son," it began. Not Daniel. Not a formal greeting. My son. His chest tightened instantly, anger and grief tangling so tightly he couldn't tell them apart anymore. I wrote about the night I found him in the garage, how I'd known something was wrong long before he ever said a word. I admitted my failures plainly without defending them. No excuses, no softening, just the truth, stripped bare. I wrote that I had been afraid, not just of Arthur, but of the world. Afraid that if I spoke too soon, too loudly, the world would punish Daniel for surviving something it didn't want to look at. Afraid that the justice system would fail him the way it had failed so many others. Afraid that if Arthur was exposed and not stopped, Daniel would be left unprotected. I chose a path that asked too much of you, I wrote. And I will regret that choice for as long as regret exists. Daniel stopped reading then. He pressed the heel of his hand into his eyes, willing the words away. For years, he'd told himself I hadn't seen, that I'd known and done nothing, that I'd chosen comfort over courage. But the letter made something clear that shattered that belief. I had seen, I had known, and I had been carrying it alone. He kept reading. I told him the reason for the conditions in the will, that I didn't want his inheritance to arrive quietly, mistaken for favoritism or guilt money. I wanted him to receive it with the truth fully exposed, so no one could ever again suggest his pain was imagined or exaggerated or inconvenient. I wrote that the house went to Marianne because she needed roots while Daniel needed freedom. That the money given to charity came from a place of repentance, not virtue. Money I couldn't stand to keep knowing how much silence it had bought. And then I wrote the line that broke him. I was never ashamed of you. I was ashamed of myself. The letter ended with a request, not a demand, a plea, that he forgive me if he could. And if he couldn't, that he at least stop believing the lie that he had been abandoned. Daniel folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it might tear if he rushed. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he returned to the house one more time, walked through rooms he hadn't stepped into in decades, opened drawers, found small, unexpected traces of love he'd been too angry to see before, old report cards I'd kept, photos of him tucked into books, a graduation announcement folded into a Zaid recipe box. Marianne came the next day. She came ready to fight. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, voice sharp. So, you got what you wanted. Daniel looked at her, not with resentment this time, but with something closer to exhaustion. You should see what's downstairs, he said. She refused at first, said she didn't want to dig up more drama, said she was tired of feeling manipulated by a dead woman. But curiosity has a way of overpowering pride. She went down. She stayed longer than Daniel had. When she came back up, her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed, anger replaced by something she didn't have a name for yet. She never told me, Marianne whispered. Not any of it. She was trying to protect you too, Daniel said quietly. Just differently. For the first time in years, they sat at the same table without tension thickening the air. They talked, not perfectly, not easily, but honestly, about what they each lost. About how silence had shaped them in different ways. About how loving the same mother didn't mean they'd experienced the same woman. Word spread, slowly at first. Ruth tried to dismiss the evidence, called it exaggeration, said grief makes people invent stories, but people had seen enough now. The journals, the recordings, the dates that lined up too cleanly to deny, the family villain narrative cracked, not all at once. Not cleanly, but enough. At my gravesite, weeks later, Daniel stood alone. No speeches, no flowers arranged for display, just him, the earth, and a truth that arrived too late to be spoken back to me. I'm sorry too, he said aloud, for hating you when you were trying to save me. The wind carried his words away, and for the first time since I'd become the villain in their story, something shifted. I was no longer the monster they needed to blame. I was just a woman who survived, made impossible choices, and loved her children the only way she knew how. There was one last thing I never told them. It wasn't in the journals, not on the tapes, not even folded into the letter Daniel read with shaking hands. Some truths don't need to be documented, they only need to be lived with. In the final year of my life, when my body had begun to betray me in small, humiliating ways, hands that dropped cups, legs that forgot their strength, I used to sit by the front window every evening just before dusk. The neighborhood had changed by then. New families, new laughter, children who didn't know the history of that house or the woman behind the glass. Sometimes I imagined Daniel walking up the path, sometimes Marianne. Most nights, neither came, and yet I waited. Not with resentment, not even with hope, just with a quiet acceptance that love doesn't always arrive when you want it to, but that doesn't mean it was never real. I used to talk to Arthur in those moments, though not the way people might expect. I didn't curse him. I didn't forgive him either. I simply told him he no longer owned our story, that the truth, even delayed, had slipped through his fingers, that the silence he depended on had finally turned against him. There was peace in that. On the night before I went into the hospital for the last time, I dreamed of Daniel as a little boy. He was standing in the yard, dirt on his knees, holding a broken toy, looking at me like he was waiting for permission to cry. In the dream, I knelt down and told him it was all right, that he didn't have to be strong anymore. When I woke up, my pillow was wet. I think that's when I knew I was done holding things in. After I was gone, after the house settled into its new rhythms, and my name stopped being spoken with quite so much heat, something small but meaningful happened. It wasn't announced. It didn't make its way through the family grapevine. Daniel started telling the truth, not loudly, not publicly, just honestly. When his child asked about me, he didn't say I was difficult, or cold, or unfair. He said, "She made hard choices in a world that didn't give her good ones." When Marianne heard that for the first time, she cried in the pantry where no one could see her. And Ruth, my sister, my quiet critic, eventually stopped correcting people when they spoke about me too harshly. She never apologized. That wasn't her way. But silence, this time, wasn't a weapon. It was surrender. Years from now, when memories blur and stories shorten, I know I won't be remembered as a saint. And that's all right. I don't need to be redeemed in every telling. I only needed the people who mattered most to know that I loved them, even when love looked like distance, conditions, and unbearable quiet. Especially then. Because the truth is, I was never the family villain. I was a woman who survived something she didn't have words for, a mother who chose protection over approval, a witness who waited until it was finally safe to speak. And when my will was read, it didn't just divide what I owned. It reunited what had been broken by secrecy and fear. That was my real inheritance, not money, not property, not even forgiveness, but understanding. And in the end, that was enough to let me rest.